Well, hey, good afternoon to you. It is 6:06 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we are making sense of the news. Coming up on the program, Joe Simonson will be here at 4:30 from the Washington Free Beacon as Joe Biden lies to a federal investigator. Will he be charged, or will they just say he's an elderly old man with a poor memory? Sympathetic? Did I miss that? Sympathetic elderly man. And then Will Scharf is here, 5 o'clock. We talked to him about Donald Trump's big legal successes today. He had a couple, actually. And then Eddie Scarry will be joining us at 5:30 from The Federalist. Those of you with clear ears and clear minds may have thought to yourself, I thought Eddie Scarry was coming on at 4 o'clock. He was, until he texted us just a moment ago and said, guys, I got to move it. And I was like, all right, 5:30. We'll do 5:30, which gives me an opportunity right now to talk to you. Also, I'll take your calls at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. But I do, as I was just talking about with Mike, I want to tell you about what Leslie Stahl did last night on 60 Minutes, and it was as misleading as ever. They gave her the A block, the very beginning of the show, to mislead the audience about disinformation combat. So the American left has a tremendous amount of government money and left-wing donor money being dumped into censorship efforts. And we've talked about them at length right here on the program. And, of course, there are a number of great news outlets that have been covering all of this, many of which you'll know by name. Places like the Daily Caller, of course, covering with aggression all of the censorship efforts that the left has been undertaking. And remember, the point at which this all really begins is 2016, or at least where it begins in earnest. Donald Trump beating Hillary Clinton was seen as an existential threat to the establishment. And so they reacted not by trying to make better appeals to voters, not by, say, going to Wisconsin before Election Day. That's not how they responded. They responded by setting their sights on the American people, turning their cash cannons on, and firing them into every operation they could that would censor the American people. So that means a constellation of non-governmental organizations. That means the federal government being subverted. That means the Department of Homeland Security training its sights on American citizens instead of foreign threats to protect the integrity of the homeland, all in an effort to advance and sustain power for Democrats without making an actual electoral case to the public. Instead, they'll hide information from the public, mislead them, censor what they're allowed to express and consume. And so this is a big problem. And you've got a bunch of tech companies, either because they're politically on the same side as the left or they're under threat from the left, who have assisted in this. And so any honest journalist would dig into this and say, okay, this is a massive problem for the free flow of communication. Let's fix this. And we'll have a healthier, what do they say? Democracy. That's the phrase they use. Our constitutional republic is healthier when people can express themselves freely and consume others freely. Way healthier. But that's not what we got. So 60 Minutes last night, they did a big package on disinformation and how the stupid conservatives, the stupid right wing, think that there's an effort to try and censor them. Here's Leslie Stahl. Take a listen to some of this.
The Supreme Court is considering whether the platforms are like newspapers, which have free speech rights to make their own editorial decisions, or if they're more like telephone companies that merely transmit everyone's speech. If the laws are upheld, the platforms could be forced to carry hate speech and false medical information.
Could you tell us what hate speech is? And when you say false medical information, what might you be talking about? I mean, she's already framing the argument for a left-wing audience, right, who are primed to believe this as they're consuming 60 Minutes. But she says false medical information. So, for instance, I'll give you some false medical information. Wearing a mask stops COVID. Wearing a mask stops COVID. Well, that's obviously false. We've known that for some time. But at one point, it was forbidden from saying out loud. You weren't allowed to say that. In fact, the social media companies would either append a tag to your statement saying, that's not what the government says, you should trust the government, or they would just censor you outright, or they would suppress the reach of your post. That means the ability for other people to see it. They would use algorithmic suppression to prevent your information from getting out there. In other words, they would censor you, sometimes without your knowledge. So when she says, oh, the platforms, they're going to have to carry hate speech. What's hate speech? Is saying that there is no such thing. If a man says he's a woman, that he's wrong. Is that hate speech? Well, yes. By the left's definition, that is hate speech to say that out loud. That a man should not be in a woman's locker room. That a man should not play on a woman's sports team. If you tell a man, sorry, I know you say you're a woman. You're not a woman. That's hate speech by the left's definitions. So this is what Leslie Stahl is defending, this type of censorship.
Upheld, the platforms could be forced to carry hate speech and false medical information, the very content most big tech companies have spent years trying to remove through teams of content moderators. But in the process, conservatives claim that the companies have engaged in a conspiracy to suppress their speech.
And pushed along by the federal government, where you have the feds in contact with these tech companies telling them to censor broad categories of information. And what power do the feds have over these big corporations? Well, one, you of course have the political loyalty that come with a lot of these left-wing Silicon Valley companies. And two, the government does kind of dictate whether or not you can keep doing business. Oh, hate to have an antitrust case brought against you. That would be real rough, wouldn't it? So why don't you stick with us on this? You know, the threats are implied, obviously. But the federal government exercises extraordinary power over these companies. Here we go, a little bit more. Leslie Stahl trying to set the frame for her audience, saying, you know who's really terrible? Marjorie Taylor Greene. And the audience, they all nod together. Yes, Marjorie Taylor Greene, evil.
As in this case, a tweet in 2022 from Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene falsely claiming that there were extremely high amounts of COVID vaccine deaths.
Falsely claiming. So Leslie Stahl doesn't feel any obligation to do any journalism about the claim whatsoever. She just waves it off out of hand. She's just lying, she says.
I've not misled anyone. I've not put out misinformation.
Twitter eventually banned Greene's personal account for multiple violations of its COVID policy.
The social media companies, by the way, speaking of the jab, they were stopping people from even talking about myocarditis among young men, swelling hearts as a result of getting the jab. Don't you think that that's a meaningful conversation to have in a healthy, flourishing democracy? Not Leslie Stahl.
Facebook and YouTube also removed or labeled posts they deemed misinformation.
All right, and then Leslie Stahl turns to an expert. And when you hear the 60 Minutes is relying on an expert now to give them the lowdown on what's happening in America, you can be confident that that person is corrupted by left-wing politics. Her expert here is someone called Kate Starbird. Kate Starbird. If you look up into her background at all, you'll see at one point she was a WNBA player. How about that? That's not even the highlight of her career. Now it's a federal censorship goon. But Kate Starbird is a professor at the University of Washington. And here's what that conversation sounds like.
Are researchers being chilled?
Absolutely.
Kate Starbird is a professor at the University of Washington, a former professional basketball player, and a leader of a misinformation research group created ahead of the 2020 election.
We were very specifically looking at misinformation about election processes, procedures, and election results. And if we saw something about that, we would pass it along to the platforms if we thought it violated one of their policies.
Yeah, see, so they started this group that was encouraging the social media companies to censor the things that they disagreed with. If you raise a red flag about the way Pennsylvania is conducting its elections, if you say, wait a second, the state legislature didn't even vote on that. If you say, well, hold on a second, there's a massive discrepancy between how left-wing jurisdictions and right-wing jurisdictions are handling something called ballot curing, that is, sending ballots back to voters or changing it on your own, how those ballots were submitted. You made a mistake. We fixed it for you. Now you're voting for Biden. None of that can be discussed because it's misinformation, you see. Of course, all of that really happened. Here's Leslie Stahl saying, because you're such a good American citizen investigating all of these lies, has anyone ever threatened you? And Kate Starbird says, yes, one person.
I understand that some of the researchers, including you, have had some threats against them, death threats.
I have received one. sometimes they're threats with something behind them, and sometimes they're just there to make you nervous and uncomfortable, and it's hard to know the difference.
How is she talking in plural, having received one? You know, sometimes they're this and sometimes they're that. I've received one, she says. Holy, you've received one? Get in line, sweetheart. Yeah. If you do anything in public, these days, you got to receive a couple of death threats along the way. One, she says. One. All right. Well, even her own story contains misinformation. And she says there's a campaign, and this is Leslie Stahl is not scrutinizing her at all and the role that she's playing in the censorship regime. She is instead doing a fluff piece here, and she says, oh, these people are criticizing you. They're trying to discredit you.
This campaign against you is meant to discredit you.
Is that a question? What is that? Is that this is a statement?
So we won't believe you.
Absolutely. It's interesting that the people that pushed voter fraud lies are some of the same people that are trying to discredit researchers that are trying to understand the problem.
Did your research find that there was more misinformation spread by conservatives?
Absolutely. I think not just our research across the board looking at the 2020 election found that there was more misinformation spread by people that were supporters of Donald Trump or conservatives. And the events of January 6th kind of underscore this.
Yes, that's right. It's conservatives who express all of the disinformation. It's almost, there's like nothing on the left. I mean, besides Jussie Smollett and besides Hillary Clinton maintaining that she won the 2016 election, it was stolen from her. Besides every Democrat in Congress who's raised objections after every single election this century, claiming that the election was actually stolen from them whenever a Republican wins. Other than those things, other than of course, the Trump-Russia collusion scandal. Other than that, other than, the Kyle Rittenhouse saga, other than the Michael Brown hands up, don't shoot thing, other than that, other than the circumstances of George Floyd's death, other than Black Lives Matter as an organization and what it actually was doing, which was betraying every single person who gave them a dime, other than those things, other than Joe Biden's entire political history of lying throughout all of it, including about the nature of the way his family makes money. Other than those things, just a tremendous amount of disinformation coming from the right. By the way, that list is much more extensive than I can remember off the top of my head. But hello, come on. This is such a scam. And let me tell you what 60 Minutes didn't tell you about this lady, Kate Starbird. They told you she was a WNBA player, former professional basketball player. Wow, that's interesting. What they didn't tell you is that she is heavily funded by the federal government. They didn't think that was worthy of bringing up during this segment. In fact, the University of Washington back in August of 2021, this would be the Biden administration, was bragging on its website $2.25 million in NSF funding, National Science Foundation, will support the Center for an Informed Public Research. Guess who runs that center? Oh, that's Kate Starbird. Kate Starbird is in charge of that center that they were bragging about receiving multiple millions of taxpayer dollars in order to advance their censorship regime. Also, Kate Starbird has been a member of the Department of Homeland Security's Advisory Committee on combating, quote, misinformation. She's been advising the government, that is the Biden administration, on how to both monitor and confront speech that the government disagrees with. And their targets aren't just so-called disinformation and misinformation. Those are commonly understood to be things that are wrong, either intentionally or unintentionally. That's the difference, dis or misinformation. But also malinformation. Government records obtained by the Daily Caller show that this advisory committee decided that the federal government's mission should include confronting, quote, malinformation. Malinformation means something that's true but is politically inconvenient. Something that's true but is politically inconvenient. Say, maybe you raise the idea that, hey, COVID deaths, not quite as high as the government claims, because a lot of people who were written down as COVID deaths, turns out they died with COVID, not of COVID. They died of something else. They got hit by a bus, and they had COVID at the time. They were included as a COVID death. You shouldn't do that. That, by the way, that's real. That's exactly how it happened. It went down. That would be malinformation. Well, that's politically inconvenient. Don't say that. you're gonna make people think it's totally safe out there. It is not safe. It's very dangerous out there. And the list goes on and on. So 60 Minutes did not tell you that this woman has taken millions of dollars from the federal government, is a part of a DHS advisory panel, and I should add one other thing. She's also a Biden donor. It didn't come up. You can pull her FEC records right now, Federal Elections Commission. You can see all of the Democrats she's given to. Raphael Warnock, John Ossoff, Act Blue, Joe Biden. Cha-ching, 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 cha-ching. She keeps giving him cash. Never once comes up during Leslie Stahl's probing interview about what's going on in the United States with mis and disinformation. The American people are being misled. It's not by the right. It's by Leslie Stahl. Okay, this is a wild breaking news headline out of Bloomberg. Trump's net worth now hits $6.4 billion. This is today, making him one of the world's 500 richest people. Now, 6.4, this is one of those moments where I'm like, I bet you Trump is going to say it's actually higher. He's going to look, he's like, no way. I'm not, what are you saying? I'm poor? I'm not 6.4 billion. Listen to the lead sentence on this Bloomberg piece, though. Donald Trump's business empire was supposed to be in peril like never before on Monday. Instead, it turned into the single greatest day on record for the former president's wealth. Facing a deadline to post a bond of more than $500 million in a New York fraud lawsuit, a state appeals court tossed him a lifeline, slashing the amount he'd have to post to $175 million, an amount he says he'll cover. Around the same time, his social media company, Trump Media and Technology Group, wrapped up a 29-month-long merger process, meaning shares worth billions of dollars on paper are now officially Trump's. All told, his net worth will increase by more than $4 billion. This means for the first time ever, Trump is set to join the ranks of the world's wealthiest 500 people on the Bloomberg billionaires list with a fortune of $6.4 billion. Just enjoy this sound right now, because if you open the window to your car, my guess is you're going to hear some of the most blood-curdling screeching you've ever heard. Oh, gosh. Goodness gracious. Joe Simonson will join us coming up in a moment from the Washington Free Beacon. Joe Biden appears to have lied to Robert Hur, which last I checked was a crime. We're going to find out what the lie was about. You don't want to miss it. Joe's up next. Hey, good afternoon to you. 4:35 here at News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up, Will Scharf joins us, an attorney for President Trump, also a candidate for Attorney General in Missouri. We'll chat with him about Donald Trump's big legal successes today. He's had a couple. And then Eddie Scarry will be joining us from The Federalist, as all of the mental patients at MSNBC are going absolutely bonkers over the hiring of Ronna Romney McDaniel. I mean, I guess it's something, but is it worth going crazy over? I don't think so. You can join us, 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Over the course of a bunch of hours, Joe Biden apparently told Robert Hur a lot of different stories. Just random stuff. Robert Hur didn't even know why he was talking about this random stuff, but he just kept writing it all down. And among the things he said, he told a story about his time as a young lawyer defending a company against a man who was suing them for having put him in an unsafe environment where his junk was burned off. I'm sorry, what? Yeah, that's the story. But is it true? Well, for that, we turn to a journalist. Joe Simonson, senior investigative reporter for the Washington Free Beacon, joins us now. Joe, good to have you back with us, sir.
Vince, thank you.
Yeah, this one stuck out to me as one of the funnier moments from the Robert Hur transcript, where he was talking about some poor fella who apparently burned his junk off. But give us a kind of a scene setter here for why Joe Biden was talking about this in the first place.
Sure, absolutely. And that's actually kind of important to the extent one can make sense of why Biden goes on these various tangents. But there does seem to be some logic to this one. So as you know, and your listeners probably know, Biden had a bunch of documents in his house. He took boxes full of stuff from his time as vice president, to various offices and homes and things such as that. So Biden had to explain, well, why was that stuff all there? And one of his, and including some classified information, which is why he was in this situation.
Yeah.
And so the question is, well, why did you have all this stuff? And so Biden was telling special counsel Hur that, well, I've had a really interesting life. And I'm working on a memoir, and I have this biographer who's doing a book on me, and I never kept a diary. Jill always said I needed to keep a diary, but I didn't keep a diary. And that is how I ended up with all these documents in my house, and some classified stuff got thrown in there. And so part of his rationale for telling these stories is, well, I mean, you wouldn't believe the kind of stuff I've seen in my very long and storied career. And one of the things, and this is his political origin story, is the scene is 1968, and Biden graduated from Syracuse Law School. His grades were not good, as we know, and he failed a class for plagiarizing. But he was so good looking, according to Joe Biden, that he actually got an offer from a real estate development firm. But here's the catch.
Yeah.
They wouldn't hire him until he passed the bar. So he said, okay, no problem. I'll go back home. I'll go to Wilmington, and I'll join this local high-powered firm that does a lot of high-profile litigation. And Biden says, I was thinking about being a Republican at the time. I was even a Republican for 5 minutes. And he helped organize the Christmas party, and all the partners there were Republicans. But a case comes across the firm's desk. And as you said, this young man, 23 years old, was a welder, and he suffered this horrific accident. All this fluid got on his pants and lit on fire while he was working in a vessel, and he burned off his most of his lower torso, his genitalia, as you alluded to.
Mm-hmm.
So the partner at the firm says, Joe, you're new here. Why don't you draft a memo and show why this guy was negligent, and we'll win the case. And Joe says, okay, no problem. He does it. Basically, a day later, they show up in court, and the judge tosses out the case, and Biden looks over, and the crying wife and the two kids are there. They're getting nothing. So then right after, he walks out with the partner, and the partner says, Joe, let's go get lunch. Great job. And Biden says the only time he's ever lied was when he told that partner, I can't. My dad's in town. I got to get lunch with him. Instead of going to lunch with his father, he says he marches across to another building, quits his job at the firm, and becomes a public defender that very day. None of this happened.
Well, I'm sorry, hold up. I want to get to this. I love the big reveal, which is that this is all a lie. Oh, that's hilarious. I can't wait to get to it. But I do love this moment that he told Robert Hur that the only moment he's ever lied in his entire career was about going to get lunch with his dad.
Yes, that's the only time. The only time I ever looked at someone in the eye, I swear to God, and I lied right there. And he repeats that line in his biography as well.
This is a guy whose entire career is defined by lying. I mean, everything. Go back to his presidential campaign in the late 1980s. He has to leave the presidential race because he lied about the speeches he was giving. I mean, the guy's lying nonstop.
Correct. Yeah. That's the only time he can.
That's the only time he's ever lied. Okay, got it.
And so, this stuck out to me and my colleague Andrew Kerr. And I think we discussed it last time I was on air. And, I said, do you think we could find this case? I mean, it's why he's in public service. He says, it's like, and that's why I became a public defender. That's why I realized the laws are wrong. I need to change them. That's why Joe Biden's in the White House today.
Yes, because he screwed over this guy who had his junk burned off by this mean company. And he was like, you know what? I feel so bad about what happened there. I need to turn everything around. I need to fight for the little guy now. I need to fight for him.
So we spent a very long time. We went through the National Archives. We called up all these courts. But we found something. We found the case, but we also found something more interesting. We found a news article in Joe Biden's local newspaper about a welder who faced severe burns in his lower torso and was represented, and sued his employer, the same employer that he mentions in his memoir and in the Robert Hur's interview.
Yeah.
And here's the problem. The case reached a jury verdict in April 1968, and Joe Biden didn't graduate law school until June 1968. And guess what? The welder won. He won like $300,000, which is like $3 million too. He got a huge settlement. Now, it's obviously terrible. The guy was in a wheelchair the rest of his life. It's all that. But the story, none of this happened in the way in Joe Biden's telling. And so what we think is very likely is that he just stole this story for himself, and no one's ever called him out on it.
Well, he stole it, but he also distorted it too. He reinvented the outcome. He said that the guy lost the case when in fact he actually won and got a pretty handsome sum of money out of the company for his injuries.
That's exactly right. And Biden's telling the reason the guy lost is because Biden's so smart and such a great litigator.
It's just added to the pile. By the way, just on the origin story thing, hasn't Biden told a million different political origin stories? Didn't he say he was marching in the civil rights movement? And he's told a lot of these, hasn't he?
He has a lot. A lot of them do seem to, one time it was when he was like a lifeguard and there were like a lot of black families at the pool and he thought it was terrible that they were like poorer. And then another one is his public defender. He wanted to become a public defender. Then apparently he actually told another interviewer in 1987 that he wanted to be in politics since he was an undergrad in college. So his origin story is changes by the year. But this one in particular,
it's like one of these multiverse movies, and Joe Biden is the star in all of them. Yeah.
But this one in particular was kind of the most compelling, right? I mean, it's such a crazy story, and it's something out of a movie. Like, I win this case. I have all this promise. I feel so bad about it, and I quit my job that day and become a public defender. But it never happened.
It never happened. It never happened. So you dug into this, and then you asked all the relevant parties, how do they account for themselves? What did they say?
Well, so we called the firm he worked at. So we found the case also. We found that case, and there was no appeal or whatever. It's very straightforward. So we called his law firm that he worked at, which is still exists. A slightly different name now. Some of the name partners have changed. And they say, oh, yeah, we're not familiar with the Robert Hur testimony, but we know that he's mentioned this before. He said, but they said, unfortunately, we can't confirm this happened because our records don't go back that long. And we went to the National Archives and we said, hey, can you find this case? And they find it. And we did all this searching on various legal databases. We called 2 different circuit courts where the case would have been tried. And we said, well, do you have anything else of these fact patterns? And, what are the odds that 2 guys that have, had these horrific burns working at the exact same construction company, both being welders, basically within a year of each other? And they can't find it. And what's interesting, too, is that the language Biden uses to describe what happened to this guy, he says he was cleaning a vessel. And vessel is kind of an interesting word, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't like he was in a smokestack. He wasn't like, whatever. He used the word vessel. And guess where that word first appeared? In the 1968 news article in his local paper.
So it's possible that he just read this story and said, that's a fun story. Now it's mine.
I have no idea. It's possible he read the story. It's possible that when he joined, he did work at the firm. When he joined the firm, there were case documents lying around, and he just familiarized himself with it. Maybe the partners at the firm were complaining about it, right? Maybe they're like, I can't believe we lost this case, blah, 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 blah. I don't know where he got the idea. I know that it was at the firm he worked at, but I know that there was no way that he could have been involved in the case.
Okay, so what is the White House saying? What is the Biden campaign saying? How are they accounting for Joe Biden's remarks to a federal investigator?
Oh, Vince, they haven't gotten back to me. They've read my email 50 times. I have a tracker on emails that I send, a little extension. They've read it. They know.
Don't tell people that, Joe, because then they'll stop opening your emails at all. Then they'll be like, oh no, he's tracking how many times they're reading it. But you've already said it, so you can't put the cat back in the bag. 50 times now. The White House has read your email 50 times, and they refuse to actually send you an answer of any substance or any answer at all at this point.
Well, no, and what someone pointed out to me, a friend of mine pointed out, he said, the funny thing is that in the 0.0001% chance, it's probably even smaller than that there was some identical case that Biden, worked on, the same construction company, blah, blah, blah. That means that the White House then has to come out and be like, oh, yeah, no, actually, Joe Biden did screw over some other guy. But like I said, I think it's nearly impossible that there was some identical case that we can't find, no one can find, the law he worked at can't find, no one can find. So I think they're an awkward.
So you've established all of the facts here, which is that Biden quite obviously lied to Robert Hur. Are there consequences to that? Like if it was a normal person, if it wasn't Joe Biden, if it was someone who wasn't a sympathetic elder man with a poor memory, if you lie to a special counsel, are there legal consequences for that?
Yeah, absolutely. And there were FBI agents also at that at his testimony, and I think a lot of people remember high-profile cases where people lie to a federal agent and get charged. It's a federal offense. Martha Stewart went to prison for this. That's how they got Michael Flynn. Mm-hmm. And so this is a common prosecutorial tactic, right? You lie about something little that's not even necessarily germane to why you're in the room, and they grab you. They have you there, right? And it's like, oh, well, I know you lied about that. Why don't you start talking? And, I'm not saying that, like, obviously, do not expect the DOJ to bring charges against them. But, and unfortunately, it's very silly. I think last time I was on, I talked about how he also said he hit a target in Mongolia for bow and arrow hundreds of yards away. That didn't happen either.
That didn't happen, no.
So, I mean, we have two demonstrable lies in this interview. And again, it's silly. It's a Mongolian archery. It's a guy who burned off his junk, all that. But the point, though, of these lies is to explain why he had all these documents.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and why he stole them in the first place. So he's offering explanations, and the explanations themselves are lies. How is the rest of the media covering this today? This is a great report, by the way. I read it, and I was like, we've got to have Joe on. You wrote it alongside the fabulous Andrew Kerr, too, who deserves a lot of credit here. Are the rest of the press picking this up? I mean, because it's the kind of story that, if the parties were reversed, the New York Times would be all over.
Well, that's great that's so interesting that you bring up the New York Times, because the New York Times wrote up Biden's interview when it came out, and the headline was Biden's amazing life, essentially, from archery to this to that. And the kicker, this is from the New York Times. I know. I feel like I'm going. I sound crazy when I tell it to people who aren't plugged in. Uh-huh. And the kicker in this New York Times piece, the last two paragraphs were, and he recounted a story about this horrific injury, blah blah, and then it's like. And the next thing you know, he's in the White House. And it's like, you didn't bother looking into this at all?
Wait, they yada, yada, yada did the man burns his junk off story right to Biden's in the White House now? I love that.
Well, they're so inspired by it. It's like we're supposed to be so amazed that this happened. And then I saw, and I'll leave it at this, but looking up, I was like, who else has reported on this story? Because he mentions it in his official biography. And I think it was BuzzFeed News or NBC or something or whatever was talking about his work as a public defender. Yeah. And they talk about this case with this welder. And the reporter even writes, and it was like something out of a John Grisham novel. I'm like, yeah, it is like something out of a John Grisham novel. Yeah. It didn't happen. You didn't bother checking.
It's so crazy. Yeah, so he starts his career with a castrated welder and ends it with a castrated media. That's where we are now. Hey, Joe Simonson, thank you very much for actually still doing the hard work and digging in on these questions. Really appreciate your time and the effort at the Washington Free Beacon. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ben.
Good to talk to you. It's 4:52. Let me take a phone call. John's calling in from Loudoun County. Now, line one. John, good afternoon. You're on the Vince Coglianese Show.
Hey, Vince. Great show.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, hey, I was just calling about some of the strategies maybe to use when these budgets come up. Obviously, you were reviewing all the things the Democrats got in this last budget spending deal.
Yeah.
Ridiculous stuff. So why don't the Republicans play their game and put things in there like subsidizing AR-15 purchases, or maybe subsidizing ammo purchases, or training for weapons. Something that'll really tick them off.
Yeah, and plus be helpful. That's actually kind of great.
Yeah, I mean, use some, force them to maybe stop funding.
It's funny, John, to your point, Republicans apparently were all very excited about this weekend. They did apparently get into the bill a ban on flying the LGBTQ plus IA flag at embassies all around the planet. And the White House is all angry about this. So I guess to your point, they achieved that, but it's kind of not enough for me to throw down a $1.2 trillion bill full of, outfits to strangle the genitals of children. I kid you not. That is literally in the bill. They have a whole thing about breast binders and crotch binders. It's nuts. So, I'd rather not have that and let them fly the ridiculous rainbow flags. But, when do I get what I want? Coming up, I'm going to chat with Will Scharf. He'll be joining us. He's an attorney for President Trump. He's got some reaction to what happened today.